They laughed at the woman's tattoo until a Hell's Angel revealed the truth. The sky outside Millie's diner was still the color of a bruise, dark purple fading into gray, when Carol Whitfield pulled her old Buick into the gravel lot. 5:30 in the morning, same as always. Same as it had been for 15 years. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out, watching the diner's neon sign flicker awake in the darkness. Millie's. The M buzzed a little these days, like it was tired too. Carol let herself in through the back door, her keys jingling in the quiet. The smell hit her the way it always did. Old coffee grounds, bacon grease soaked into the walls, the faint sweetness of pancake syrup that never quite washed away no matter how many times she scrubbed. It was a smell she'd stopped noticing years ago. It was just home now. More home than her actual house, if she was honest with herself. She flipped on the lights one row at a time, watching the diner wake up around her. The red vinyl booths, the checkered floor that Daniel used to tease her about, said it looked like a chessboard for giants. The old jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked since before she started working here. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. Carol moved through her routine, like a dance she'd memorized so long ago she didn't have to think about the steps anymore. Coffee grounds into the filter, water into the machine. She wiped down the counter in slow, even circles, even though it was already clean from closing last night. She just liked the feeling of doing something with her hands. She tied her apron around her waist and reached for the buttons at her wrists, making sure her sleeves were buttoned tight. It was already warm outside, the kind of thick June heat that clung to a person's skin like a wet towel, and by noon, the diner would be sweltering despite the old window units rattling in their frames. Carol would sweat through her blouse like she did every summer day. But the sleeves stayed down. They always did. Nobody asked anymore. They used to when she first started wearing them, back when Daniel had only been gone a few months, and grief still sat on her like a stone. Miss Peggy had asked once, gentle as anything, if Carol wasn't just burning up in those long sleeves. Carol had smiled and said she chilled easy, that her circulation wasn't what it used to be. It wasn't true, but it was easier than the truth, and after a while folks stopped asking. They just figured that was Carol. Modest, a little old-fashioned. A woman who kept herself covered up and kept to herself mostly, except for the kindness she poured into everyone else's coffee cup. Nobody knew what was underneath. Nobody needed to. By 6:30, the regulars started drifting in. Earl came first, like he always did. His mail route retired, but his body still waking up at the same hour it had for 30 years. He settled onto his usual stool at the counter, third from the end, and Carol had his coffee poured before he even asked. "Morning, Earl." "Morning, Carol Ann." He always used her middle name, had since she was young, said it made her sound like somebody in an old country song. She liked that about him. Miss Peggy came in a few minutes later, her silver hair set just right, her purse clutched in both hands like it held state secrets instead of tissues and hard candy. "The usual, sweetheart," she said, though she said it every single day, and Carol always nodded like it was new information. Western omelet, dry wheat toast, coffee with too much cream. Carol called it back to the kitchen without needing to think. The morning moved like that, slow and familiar, filled with small talk about weather and grandkids and the price of gas. Carol smiled, and refilled cups, and listened to stories she'd heard 100 times before. And if there was a hollow place inside her chest where a different kind of morning used to live, one with Daniel's voice drifting from the next room, she didn't let it show. She'd gotten good at that, 15 years of practice. By 11, the diner had gone quiet again, caught in that lull between breakfast and lunch. Carol wiped down tables that didn't need wiping and watched the clock, waiting for the noise to start back up. It was just past noon when the bell above the door jingled, and 3 young women walked in, laughing loud, phones already raised, snapping pictures of the checkered floor like it was something out of a magazine. Carol grabbed 3 menus from the stack by the register and headed toward the corner booth, where the young women had settled in, still snapping pictures of everything in sight. One of them, a pretty girl with long blonde hair and sunglasses pushed up on her head, was filming the ceiling fan like it was some kind of rare bird. "Y'all want menus? Or do you already know?" Carol asked, setting them down with a smile. "Oh my gosh, this place is so cute," the blonde one said. Her name tag on her tote bag read Brittany in glittery letters. "Sasha, look at the syrup dispensers. They're like vintage." The girl next to her, dark-haired with a nose ring, snapped a picture of the dispenser before even glancing at the menu. "This whole town is like stepping into a time machine," Sasha said. "No offense," she added, glancing up at Carol like it had just occurred to her that a real person was standing there. "None taken," Carol said, and she meant it. She'd heard worse from folks passing through. Millie's got its fair share of city people on their way to somewhere else, stopping in for a taste of small-town charm before hurrying back to wherever charm didn't matter so much. The third girl, Kayla, had her phone propped against the napkin holder, filming herself talking to the camera in a low, excited voice. "We are literally in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky right now, and this diner is giving major nostalgia vibes. Y'all have to see this." "Can I start you ladies with some coffee?" Carol asked. "Yes, please," Brittany said. "Do you have oat milk?" "Just cream, honey. Regular and half. Brittany made a face like Carol had told her something tragic, but she nodded anyway. "That's fine, I guess. When in Rome." Carol went to fetch the coffee pot, and when she came back, the 3 of them were deep in conversation about their trip, some road trip down to Nashville for a bachelorette party, stopping through little towns along the way to post pictures. Carol only half listened as she poured coffee into Sasha's cup, then leaned across the table to fill Kayla's. That was when it happened. Her sleeve, worn thin from years of washing, caught on the edge of the table just enough to ride up her forearm. Just a few inches. Just enough. The rose was faded now, the pink gone soft and dusty with time, but the wings around it were still clear enough to see, black lines feathered out on either side like something ready to take flight. It had been there 30 years, long enough to fade into her skin like it belonged there. Long enough that Carol sometimes forgot it was even there at all, until moments like this one. Sasha's eyes went wide first, then Brittany's. Then Kayla, phone already in hand, swung the camera around so fast her elbow knocked into her coffee cup. "Oh my gosh," Sasha said, and then she laughed, a sharp bark of a laugh that carried across the diner. No way, Grandma's got biker ink." "Is that real?" Brittany asked, leaning forward, squinting at Carol's arm like she was looking at some kind of zoo animal. "Like, is that an actual tattoo?" Kayla was already filming, giggling behind her phone, her voice pitched high with delight. "This is too good. This is literally too good. Sweet little grandma waitress has a secret biker tattoo. Oh my gosh, you guys." Carol felt the heat rise up her neck and into her face so fast it was like someone had struck a match against her skin. She yanked her sleeve down hard, the fabric catching again for one terrible second before it finally slid into place, covering the rose, covering the wings, covering 30 years of something she'd never once explained to another living soul. Her hand shook as she gripped the coffee pot, and for a moment she thought she might drop it right there on the checkered floor. She managed to steady herself just enough to turn away from the booth, her face burning, her ears ringing with the sound of their laughter following her like a shadow. She was halfway to the kitchen, coffee pot trembling in her grip, when the bell above the door jingled behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't look. She was too shaken, too humiliated, too busy trying to hold herself together to notice who had just walked in. The bell above the door was still swinging on its little brass hook when Boone Kessler stepped inside Millie's diner, and the whole room seemed to catch its breath at once. He was a big man, the kind that filled up a doorway, with shoulders like he'd spent a lifetime hauling things other men couldn't lift. His leather cut was worn soft at the edges, patches sewn on careful and proud, the kind of jacket that told a story if you knew how to read it. His boots were scuffed. His beard had gray in it now, streaked through the brown like frost on a fence post. 45 years old, and every one of those years showed on his face, not in a tired way, but in a way that said he'd earned the lines. Earl set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. Miss Peggy's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow, though of course it hadn't. It just felt that way, the way a room feels when everybody in it goes still at the same time. Boone didn't notice any of them. Not really. His eyes were already moving, sweeping the diner the way a man's eyes move when he's looking for something he's spent years searching for and has almost given up hope of finding. They landed on Carol. She was near the kitchen door, back mostly turned, the coffee pot still trembling slightly in her grip. Her sleeve had fallen back into place, covering her arm completely, but Boone had caught the last half-second of it. The rose, the wings. Faded, yes. Dulled by 3 decades of sunlight and soap and time, but unmistakable to a man who'd carried the memory of that exact design in his chest for 15 years. His breath left him like he'd been hit. He didn't say anything to Brittany, Sasha, or Kayla, even though all 3 of them had swiveled in their booth to gawk at him, phones still raised, filming this new stranger like he was part of the same show. He didn't look at Earl. He didn't look at Miss Peggy. He walked straight across the diner floor, boots heavy on the checkered tile, until he reached the counter where Carol had stopped. She heard him before she saw him, heard the boots, felt the shift in the air, the way a room changes when someone big moves through it. She turned, coffee pot still in hand, and found herself looking up into the face of a man she had never seen before in her life. He was staring at her arm, not her face. Her arm, like he could see straight through the fabric of her sleeve to what lay beneath. "Ma'am." His voice came out rough, low, thick with something that sounded almost like grief. "Ma'am, I need you to show me that tattoo again, please." Carol's whole body went cold. Her hand moved before her mind caught up to it, pressing flat against her sleeve, covering the place where the rose and wings lay hidden beneath the worn cotton. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could see it in her throat. "Excuse me?" she managed. And her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Thinner, like a girl's voice instead of a 52-year-old woman who had been running this diner floor for 15 years. "Please," Boone said again. And there was nothing threatening in it, nothing hard or demanding, just a raw kind of need that didn't match the leather and the patches and the size of him at all. "I know this is strange. I know I'm a stranger to you. But that tattoo on your arm, I need to see it again. It's important. It's more important than I know how to explain right now." Behind him, Brittany had lowered her phone slightly, her mocking smile faltering into something like confusion. Sasha and Kayla had gone quiet, too. The laughter drained clean out of them, replaced by the same wary curiosity that had settled over Earl and Miss Peggy, and every other regular in the diner. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the faint sizzle of something on the grill in the back, forgotten for the moment by everyone in the room. Carol stood frozen behind the counter, her hand still pressed against her sleeve, feeling the weight of every eye in Millie's diner resting on her, waiting to see what she would do. Carol looked at Boone's face for a long moment. She was searching for something. Meanness, maybe. Some kind of trick. But she couldn't find it. All she saw was a big man with tired eyes, looking at her like she held something precious in her hands. Her fingers moved to her sleeve. Slowly she began to roll it up. The fabric slid past her wrist, past her forearm, revealing skin that had gone soft and pale with age. And there it was. The rose, once a deep red, now faded to a dusty pink. The wings that curved around it, once sharp and clean, now blurred at the edges like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Boone's breath caught. He leaned forward, his big hands braced on the edge of the counter, and Carol saw them shake. Actually shake, like a man twice his age. He stared at that tattoo like it was the answer to a question he had asked 1,000 times without ever getting a reply. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had gone soft now, gentle in a way that didn't match his size at all. "What's your name?" "Carol," she said. "Carol Whitfield." He nodded slowly, like he was fitting that name into a puzzle he'd been building for years. Then his eyes came back up to hers, and she saw something in them that looked almost like fear. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Who gave you this design?" The diner had gone so quiet that Carol could hear the clock ticking above the pie case. Earl had turned all the way around in his stool now. Miss Peggy had set down her fork entirely. Even the 3 young women in the corner booth had gone still, phones forgotten in their laps, watching with wide eyes. Carol swallowed hard. Her arm still hung there between them, bare and exposed in a way it hadn't been in public for years. "My husband," she said quietly. "Daniel. He gave me the design. Back when we were young, before we got married. He drew it out himself on a napkin, sitting right here in this diner, if you can believe that." She let out a small, shaky laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. "He said it was something he'd been carrying around in his head for a long time. Said he wanted me to have it. Wanted it to mean something between us." Boone's jaw tightened. "Did he have one too? The same tattoo?" Carol nodded slowly. "Yes, same rose, same wings, right here." She touched her own forearm, the same spot on herself where Daniel had carried his. "He never told me exactly why. I asked him once, early on, and he just got quiet. Real quiet. I learned not to ask again. Some things a marriage just learns to leave alone." Boone didn't say anything for a moment. He looked down at the counter, and Carol watched something pass over his face. Something heavy. Something that looked almost like grief settling into old bones. Then he reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a wallet, worn soft and cracked at the folds like it had been carried for decades. His thick fingers, still trembling slightly, opened it with a care that seemed strange for a man his size. He pulled out a small photograph, its edges gone soft and rounded from years of handling. The colors faded but still clear enough to make out. He set it down on the counter between them, right next to the coffee pot Carol still hadn't put down. It was a photograph of a man. Younger than Boone, laughing hard at something outside the frame, sitting astride a motorcycle with the sun behind him. His sleeve was pushed up past his elbow, and there on his forearm, clear as day even in the old photograph, was the rose. The wings curling around it, exactly the same design, exactly the same placement. Carol stared at the photo. Her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest and refused to come back out. Her hand, still holding the coffee pot, had gone completely still. The man in the photograph was laughing, careless and alive, the way young men laugh when they think they have all the time in the world. And he looked, in a way that made Carol's whole body go cold, remarkably like Daniel. "Ma'am," Boone said, his voice still soft. "Would you mind if we sat down? I think there's a story I need to tell you, and I don't think either of us should be standing for it." Carol looked around the diner. Every eye was on her. Earl had stopped pretending to read his newspaper. Miss Peggy's hand was pressed flat against her chest. Even the 3 young women in the corner booth, the ones who had been laughing at her not 10 minutes before, sat frozen and silent, their phones face down on the table now, forgotten. She set the coffee pot down on the counter with a shaking hand. "All right," she said. "I suppose we can sit." They moved to a booth near the window, the vinyl seat creaking under Boone's weight as he settled across from her. Up close, he didn't look dangerous at all. He looked like a man carrying something heavy that he'd been carrying a long time, and was finally about to set down. "My name's Boone Kessler," he said, holding out a hand that swallowed hers whole when she shook it. "I've been a Hell's Angel for over 20 years now, and the man in that photograph, the one with the rose on his arm, his name was Frank. We called him Preacher Frank. Everybody did." "Preacher?" Carol asked. "Was he a minister?" Boone almost smiled. "No, ma'am. Nothing like that. We called him Preacher because he was always the one talking sense into the young guys, always the one saying the right thing at the right time, even when nobody wanted to hear it. He had this way of making you feel like you mattered, even if you'd never met a soul who thought so before." Carol folded her hands on the table, the faded rose still bare on her forearm. She didn't move to cover it now. 15 years ago, Boone continued, there was a fire, apartment building over in Lexington. Frank was riding by when it happened. Didn't think twice. Went in 3 times. Pulled out 3 kids one at a time before the roof came down. His voice caught, just slightly, on the last words. He didn't make it out the 4th time. Went back in for a 4th, and the building took him. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to have slowed. "He's a legend in the club," Boone said. "Everybody knows his name. The rose and wings, that was his mark. He drew it himself years before the fire. Said the rose was for beauty that survives hard things, and the wings were for the ones who go on ahead of us. He'd have that drawn on napkins, on matchbooks, anywhere he had a pen and a minute to spare." Carol's throat had gone tight. "And you think my husband knew him?" "I think more than that," Boone said gently. "The club set aside money years ago. A benevolent fund, we call it. For Frank's widow, his family, whoever he left behind. Nobody could ever find her. Frank never talked much about his people, not the family he came from. Just said there'd been trouble, a long time back, and he didn't like to dig it up." Boone's eyes met hers, steady now. "I've spent 12 years looking for that woman, Mrs. Whitfield, and today I walked into this diner behind those girls poking fun at your sleeve, and I saw that tattoo, and it about stopped my heart." Carol shook her head slowly, though her hands had started to tremble in her lap. "There's some kind of mistake," she said. "My Daniel was a mechanic. Fixed cars over at the shop on Route 9 for 30 years. Quiet man. Gentle. He never rode a motorcycle in his life that I ever saw, and he never once mentioned anybody named Frank. Not one time in 30 years of marriage." "Are you sure?" Boone asked, not unkindly. "I'm sure," Carol said, though something in her chest had gone cold and uncertain, like ice cracking under her feet. "You have the wrong woman. I'm sorry for your trouble. Truly I am. But this isn't it." Boone didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or press his case. Instead, he reached across the table and slid the photograph closer to her, until it sat directly beneath her folded hands. "Look again," he said quietly. "Just once more. Take your time." Carol picked up the photograph with both hands, the way you might hold something that could shatter. She tilted it towards the window, letting the afternoon light fall across the faded colors. Frank stood there, laughing at whoever held the camera, his arms slung over a motorcycle seat, the rose and wings bright and new on his forearm. She made herself look at his face. Really look. The jawline stopped her first. It was Daniel's jaw, the same square set she used to trace with her thumb on quiet Sunday mornings. Then the eyes. Daniel's eyes had been soft, tired around the edges from years of squinting at engines in bad light. But these eyes, Frank's eyes, had that same shape, that same deep brown color, just harder, like the same eyes had lived two very different lives. "Oh," Carol whispered, so quiet only she could hear it. Her hands had started to shake so badly the photograph trembled in her grip. She set it down flat on the table and pressed her palms against it, as if she could hold it still. Hold everything still. Memories she hadn't touched in years came rushing up like water through a cracked dam. Every October, without fail, Daniel would go quiet. Not angry quiet, sad quiet. He'd sit out on the back porch some evenings, just staring at nothing, and when she'd ask what was wrong, he'd just say, "Nothing, honey. Just an old feeling passing through." She'd never pressed him. 30 years of marriage, and she'd never once pressed him. And the funerals. She remembered now, the funeral procession that had passed them on a Route 9 2 summers before he died. Daniel had pulled the truck over so fast she'd banged her knee on the dash. He'd gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, watching the line of cars pass, and he hadn't said a single word the rest of the drive home. And the drawer. The bottom drawer of his workbench out in the garage, always locked, the key nowhere she'd ever found. She used to tease him about it, ask what he was hiding, a stash of candy bars or old love letters from some girl before her. He'd just smile that tired smile and say, "Nothing worth digging up, Carol Ann." She'd let it go. She always let things go with Daniel. That was who she was. Now she wondered what she'd been letting go of. "Mrs. Whitfield?" Boone's voice was gentle, careful, like he was talking to someone standing near a ledge. Carol looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, though she hadn't noticed the tears start. "I don't know what to tell you," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know if what you're saying is true. I don't know if it isn't. I've been married to that man's memory for 8 years now, and buried next to him for 8 years before that, and I never once heard the name Frank." She pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment, steadying herself. "I need time. I need to think. This is too much to just sit here and swallow whole." "Of course," Boone said quickly. "I didn't come here to turn your whole life upside down in one afternoon. I just needed you to see it. Whatever you decide, that's yours to decide." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn business card, the edges soft from being carried a long time. He set it on the table beside the photograph. "That's my number. I'm staying over at the Cedar Motel out on the highway, at least for the next few days. No rush, no pressure. You call me if and when you're ready. Or don't call at all, if that's what you decide. I'll understand." Carol nodded, unable to find any more words. Boone slid out of the booth, his big frame moving slow and careful, like he was trying not to disturb anything else in the room. He nodded once to her, a small, respectful gesture, and then walked toward the door, his boots heavy against the tile floor. Carol sat frozen, the photograph still clutched tight in her trembling hand, watching him go, The bell above the door jingled as it swung shut behind him. In the corner booth, Brittany, Sasha, and Kayla sat in stunned silence, their earlier laughter long gone, their faces pale with something that looked a lot like shame. The drive home felt longer than usual. Carol gripped the steering wheel with both hands, the way Daniel used to grip it that day on Route 9, and she wondered if that was where she'd learned it from, without even knowing. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway. It had been dark like this every evening for 5 years, ever since the funeral, ever since the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards stopped arriving in the mail. Carol had gotten used to the quiet. Some nights she even liked it. Tonight, the quiet felt heavy, like it was waiting for something. She didn't go inside the house. She walked straight past the back door, past the little garden she'd let go wild with weeds, out to the garage where Daniel used to spend his evenings fixing engines for half the town. Nobody paid him much. He didn't care. He just liked working with his hands, liked the smell of motor oil and the sound of a good engine turning over. Carol hadn't been out here much since he died. She kept it clean, kept the dust off his tools out of some sense of duty, but she never lingered. It hurt too much to linger. Tonight, she flipped on the single bulb hanging from the ceiling and walked straight to the workbench in the back corner. It was old, scarred with burn marks and scratches from 30 years of use. And there, at the bottom, was the drawer. Still locked, still exactly the way it had been the day he died. She knelt down in front of it, her knees cracking against the concrete floor, and pressed her palm flat against the wood. "Daniel," she whispered, "what did you do?" She thought about the key. He never carried it on his regular key ring. She remembered that much. He'd kept it somewhere separate, somewhere hidden, because he said a man was entitled to one drawer that was just his own. She'd laughed about it once, called him silly, and let it go, the way she let everything go with him. Now she needed that key more than she'd ever needed anything. She stood up and started searching. She checked the pegboard where his tools hung, running her fingers along the edges, behind the wrenches and screwdrivers. Nothing. She checked the old cigar box on the shelf above the bench, the one that used to hold spare screws and washers. Nothing but rust and dust. Her hands were shaking harder now, frustration and fear tangling together in her chest. She thought back, hard, trying to remember any small moment, any offhand comment he might have made about that key. Then it came to her, sudden and clear, like a light switching on. A coffee can. She remembered him joking once, years ago, about hiding his fishing money from her in an old coffee can so she wouldn't spend it on new curtains. She'd laughed at the time, thought it was just a joke between them. She scanned the shelves until she found it, a rusted red coffee can shoved behind a row of paint cans in the corner, so covered in dust it had practically become part of the shelf. Carol pulled it down with both hands and pried off the plastic lid. Inside, buried under a few old washers and a handful of loose change, was a small brass key. Her breath caught in her throat. She carried it back to the workbench and knelt down again in front of the drawer. Her hands trembled so badly it took her 3 tries to fit the key into the lock. When it finally slid in and turned with a soft click, Carol felt her whole body go still. She pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside was a stack of envelopes, yellowed with age, bound together with a piece of twine that had gone brittle and pale. Beneath them lay a photograph, its edges curled, showing 2 young men sitting on motorcycles, grinning at the camera like they owned the whole world. And on top of the envelopes, separate from the rest, was a single folded letter. Carol picked it up with careful fingers. She unfolded it slowly, the paper soft and worn from being handled many times, long before it ever reached this drawer. Across the top, written in handwriting she didn't recognize, was a single word. Danny. Carol stared at it. Nobody had called her husband that in the 30 years she'd known him. Not once, not ever. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The phone rang 3 times before Boone picked up. Kessler. Boone, it's Carol. Her voice came out thin, like a wire stretched too tight. I found something. Last night, in Daniel's workbench. There was a pause on the line. Carol could hear the sound of a motorcycle engine somewhere in the background. Then silence, like Boone had stepped inside somewhere quiet. What kind of something? Letters, Carol said. A whole stack of them, tied up with string, and a photograph. 2 men on motorcycles, Boone. Young men. One of them... Her voice caught. One of them could be Daniel, and there's a letter on top, separate from the rest. It says Danny on it. Just that one word. Another pause, longer this time. When Boone spoke again, his voice had gone careful, the way a man speaks when he doesn't want to spook something fragile. Don't open the rest yet, he said. Not without me there. Can you meet me at the diner before you open? Millie opens the doors at 6, Carol said. I could let you in the back around 5:30. I'll be there. Carol didn't sleep much after that call. She sat at her kitchen table until the sky outside turned the color of a bruise, purple fading into gray. And then she gathered the letters into an old shoebox, the photograph tucked on top, and drove to the diner in the dark. Boone was already waiting by the back door when she pulled in, leaning against his motorcycle with his arms crossed, looking like he hadn't slept either. He didn't say much when she let him in, just followed her to the corner booth by the window, the one furthest from the door, and waited while she set the shoebox down on the table between them. The overhead lights were off. Only the gray morning light came through the windows, soft and thin, falling across the table like a held breath. You want me to look first? Boone asked. Or you? Together, Carol said. I don't think I can do this alone. She lifted the lid off the box. The stack of envelopes sat there, tied with the same brittle twine, and on top of them, the single folded letter she'd found last night. Carol's hands were steadier this morning, but only just. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with her thumb the way you'd smooth a wrinkle out of an old photograph, careful not to tear something that had already survived so much. Boone leaned forward the moment he saw the handwriting. His whole body went still. That's Frank's writing, he said quietly. I'd know it anywhere. He used to write out the club minutes because nobody else could read Pastor Mike's chicken scratch. He almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'd know that handwriting in my sleep. Carol's eyes moved down the page. The letter wasn't long. It looked like it had been started and stopped more than once, some lines crossed out and rewritten, like the person writing it kept losing his nerve. She read it out loud, her voice barely above a whisper. Danny, I don't know how to start this letter, so I'm just going to start it. I know Dad's business going under wasn't your fault. I said things I shouldn't have said. I was scared, and I made you carry the blame because it was easier than carrying it myself. I've thought about calling 100 times. I don't know why I haven't. Maybe I'm ashamed. Maybe I just don't know what to say after all this time. I hope you're doing... The letter stopped there. Unfinished. The rest of the page was blank, like Frank had set down his pen and never picked it back up again. Carol looked up at Boone. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying yet, just standing at the edge of it. Danny, she said softly. He called him Danny. Boone nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice had gone rough, like gravel under a boot. That's what he always called him, Boone said. His little brother. Frank talked about him sometimes, late at night, when the whiskey was talking more than he was. Said he had a little brother named Danny back home. Said they'd had a falling out over their old man's business going belly up, and neither one of them ever swallowed their pride long enough to fix it. He looked at Carol, and something in his face had settled, like a puzzle piece easing into place. "Carol," he said quietly, "I think your husband was Frank's brother." Boone made the call from the parking lot, standing beside his motorcycle while Carol watched through the diner window. She couldn't hear what he said, but she could see his face, and it looked like a man choosing his words with great care. When he came back inside, he slid into the booth across from her and let out a long breath. "Pastor Mike is coming," he said. "He's the oldest member we got left from Frank's time. 73 years old, but he still rides most days. He knew Frank before I ever pinned on my colors. If anybody remembers the truth about the brothers, it's him." "How long?" Carol asked. "Couple hours. He lives about 90 minutes out. Says he wants to see the letters himself." Carol nodded and looked down at the shoebox still sitting between them. She hadn't touched the rest of the letters yet. Something in her wanted to wait, like reading them all at once would be too much for one morning to hold. Millie's diner filled up with its usual breakfast crowd, and Carol worked her shift like nothing had changed, though everything had. She poured coffee with a hand that trembled just slightly. She smiled at Earl and Miss Peggy when they came in for their usual booth, but her eyes kept drifting to the door every time the bell above it rang. Pastor Mike arrived a little after 2 in the afternoon, during the slow stretch between lunch and dinner. He came through the door slow and steady, a big man gone soft with age, his white beard reaching halfway down his chest, his leather cut faded and cracked from decades of wear. He walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the diner, the regulars, and finally landing on Carol behind the counter. "You must be Carol," he said, his voice deep and warm, like a preacher's voice, which Carol supposed was fitting given his name. "That's me," Carol said. "Can I get you some coffee, Pastor?" "Just Mike is fine," he said, easing himself into the corner booth across from Boone. "And yes, coffee would be a blessing." Carol brought the pot over and sat down beside Boone, sliding the shoebox across the table. Pastor Mike looked at it for a long moment before he reached in and lifted out the unfinished letter, the one that started with Danny. He read it slowly, his lips moving faintly with the words, and when he set it down, his eyes were wet. "That's Frank's writing, all right," he said. "I'd forgotten how much he crossed things out. Boy never could get his words right the first time, even though he had more heart than any man I ever rode with." "Did you know him?" Carol asked. "Did you know Daniel too? My husband?" Pastor Mike nodded slowly. "Not well. Daniel was younger, still living at home when Frank patched in with us. But I remember Frank talking about him. Said he had a little brother back home named Danny, quiet kid, good with his hands, always fixing something. Frank was proud of him." "What happened between them?" Carol asked. Her voice was barely steady. "Their daddy's business went under," Pastor Mike said. "Some kind of auto shop, if I recall right. There was blame thrown around, the way there always is when a family loses everything. Frank said some things he shouldn't have. Daniel left not long after. Young man, maybe 18, 19 years old. Just packed up and went, and near as I know, they never spoke again." "Never?" Carol whispered. 15 years, and they never spoke?" "Frank tried," Pastor Mike said gently. "I heard him talk about it plenty of times. Late at night around the fire, after a few beers loosened his tongue. He'd get quiet and say he had a brother out there somewhere he hadn't made right with. Said it ate at him. Every year around October he'd get low, real low, like the weight of it was pressing on him." Carol's hands went still on the table. October. Daniel's silence every October. The way he'd disappear into himself for days, unreachable, staring out the window like he was looking at something only he could see. He carried this, Carol said, so quiet it barely qualified as speaking out loud. All those years, every single October, and he never told me. 30 years of marriage, and he never once told me he had a brother. Her eyes filled, and this time the tears came freely, spilling down her cheeks as the weight of it settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She pressed her hand against her mouth, and Boone reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers, steady and warm, while Pastor Mike bowed his head in quiet respect for a grief that had waited 15 years to be spoken. The house felt too quiet after Boone and Pastor Mike left. Carol sat alone in her living room, the lamp beside her chair throwing a small circle of yellow light onto the carpet. Outside, the crickets sang their steady song, the same song they sang every night. But tonight nothing felt the same. She pulled the old photo albums down from the closet shelf, the ones covered in dust, the ones she hadn't opened in years. Daniel had never liked cameras much, but she'd taken pictures anyway, all through their marriage, because she knew someday she'd want to remember his face exactly as it was. She opened the first album, and there he was, 25 years old, standing in front of his first apartment with a wrench in his hand and grease on his cheek. He was smiling, but now, looking closer, she saw something else in his eyes, a tiredness that didn't belong on a young man's face. She turned the pages slowly. Their wedding day, Daniel in a rented suit that didn't quite fit right, looking happier than she'd ever seen him. But even then, even on that day, there was a shadow behind his smile that she'd never let herself notice. She kept turning. Christmas mornings, 4th of July picnics, their 10th anniversary, the two of them standing by the lake, his arm around her shoulders. Then she found the October pictures. There weren't many. She realized that now, really realized it, the way she flipped through page after page of summer and spring and found October nearly empty every single year. A few pictures here and there, but Daniel was never smiling in them. He stood at the edge of the frame, half turned away, like he didn't want to be caught looking sad. She remembered now, with a clarity that hurt, how every October he would grow quiet. He'd come home from the shop and sit on the back porch alone, not saying much, staring out at nothing. She used to bring him coffee and ask if something was wrong, and he'd just shake his head and say, "Just tired, Carol Ann. Just tired." She'd believed him. 30 years, and she'd believed him every single time. She remembered one October in particular, maybe 12 years back. She'd found him standing in the driveway at 2 a.m, just standing there in his robe, looking up at the sky. When she asked what he was doing, he said he couldn't sleep. He never explained further, and she never pushed. That was how they were together, gentle with each other's silences. Now she understood. He hadn't been looking at the sky. He'd been looking for his brother somewhere in it. She closed the album and sat with it in her lap for a long moment, her chest tight, before she remembered the box in the hall closet. Daniel's old things, the ones she'd never fully gone through after he passed, because grief made some boxes too heavy to open. She found it on the top shelf, pulled it down, and sorted through papers and old work gloves and a broken pocket watch until her fingers found something stiff and worn. A calendar. Old. The kind you'd get free from the hardware store, with a picture of a truck on the front. The year printed on it was from almost 20 years ago. She flipped through the months, and there, on October, she stopped. October 14th was circled in red. Not just circled once, but circled over and over, like he'd gone over the same line again and again with the pen, pressing hard enough that the paper had worn thin in that one small spot. There was no note, no explanation, just that circle, dark and deliberate, marking a day that meant something only Daniel understood. Carol's hands shook as she found more calendars in the box, different years, different pictures on the front, but every single one had October 14th circled the same way. Every year, every single year for as long as she had known him. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers and called Boone, even though it was late, even though she didn't know if he'd answer. He picked up on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. "Carol, everything all right?" "October 14th, she said, her voice cracking. "Boone, is that the day Frank died? Is that the date?" There was a pause on the line, and she could hear him breathing. And then he said quietly, Yeah, Carol, that's the date. October 14th. That's the day we lost him." Carol sat there holding the phone against her ear, staring at the calendar in her lap, at that circle worn thin from years of Daniel's pen pressing down again and again, and she began to weep, quietly at first, then harder, her shoulders shaking as 15 years of her husband's silent grief finally broke over her like a wave she hadn't seen coming. Morning came soft and gray over Millie's diner, but inside, the air buzzed with something electric. Carol felt it the moment she walked through the door, her eyes still puffy from a night of crying and calendars and old photographs spread across her living room floor. Earl was already at his usual spot by the counter, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, but he set it down the second he saw her. "Carol Ann." His voice was gentle, careful, the way you'd talk to someone who'd just been through something. "You doing all right, honey?" Miss Peggy came around the counter fast, her apron still tied crooked from rushing, and wrapped Carol in a hug before Carol could even answer. "We saw it," Peggy said into her shoulder. "The whole town's seen it. That video's got near 50,000 views now, if you can believe that. 50,000 people, Carol." Carol pulled back, confused. "What video?" Earl slid his phone across the counter, and there it was, paused on a shaky image of Carol's arm, her sleeve pulled up, her face frozen in that moment of humiliation from yesterday. Someone had posted it. One of the young women, probably, thinking it was funny, thinking it was nothing. But underneath the video were comments, hundreds of them, and Carol's eyes scanned a few. "Those girls should be ashamed of themselves. Leave that poor woman alone. Anyone else notice the biker who walks in like he knows her? What's the story here?" "People are asking about you," Peggy said. "Asking about the tattoo. Asking who that big fella was that walked in. Seems like half the internet wants to know your business now, sugar." Carol felt her stomach twist. She wasn't used to this. People looking at her, talking about her. Strangers hundreds of miles away typing her name into little glowing screens. She'd spent 30 years trying to stay small, trying not to be noticed. And now here she was, the center of something she never asked for. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, sliding onto a stool. "Boone thinks he's found something. Something about Daniel and his brother. It's a lot, Earl. It's more than I know how to carry right now." Earl reached over and patted her hand, his weathered fingers rough but kind. "You don't have to carry it alone, Carol Ann. That's what we're here for." Peggy nodded fiercely, already pouring Carol a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for but needed anyway. "This whole town loves you. Don't you forget that." The bell above the door jingled, and Carol turned, half expecting Boone, but instead it was 3 young women standing in the doorway, looking nothing like they had the day before. Gone was the loud laughter, the phones held up high, the careless smirks. Brittany, Sasha, and Kayla stood there with their shoulders hunched, their eyes red-rimmed, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The diner went quiet. Earl's jaw tightened. Peggy set down the coffee pot with a clatter. Brittany, the one who'd posted the video, stepped forward first, her hands twisting together in front of her. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, her voice shaking, Can we talk to you, please?" Carol felt every eye in the diner turn to her, waiting to see what she'd do. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to protect the little bit of dignity she had left. But she thought of Daniel, of his gentle heart, of how he never held a grudge against anyone, not even the brother who'd hurt him. "Come on over," Carol said quietly, patting the stool beside her. The girls shuffled forward, and Sasha was already crying, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her jacket. "We saw the comments," she said. "Everybody's saying we're terrible people, and we are. We were so cruel to you, and you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do anything at all." "We're so sorry," Kayla added, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know. We didn't think. We just saw a tattoo and thought it'd be funny, and it wasn't funny. It was awful, and we're so sorry." Carol looked at the three of them, young and foolish, and now genuinely broken by their own carelessness, and she felt something soften in her chest, despite everything else weighing her down. "I forgive you," she said simply. "It's all right. Really." Brittany looked up, startled, like she hadn't expected forgiveness to come so easy. "Can we—" she started, then glanced at the other two before continuing. "Can we stay? We want to understand what's happening. We want to know the real story." The afternoon lull settled over Millie's diner like a warm blanket. The lunch rush had cleared out, dishes washed and stacked, and only a few stragglers lingered over coffee. Carol wiped down the counter one last time, then poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them to the corner booth where Boone sat, his big frame looking almost too large for the little table. She slid 1 cup across to him and sat down across from him with a tired sigh. "Figured you could use a refill." Boone nodded his thanks, wrapping his rough hands around the mug. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." Carol studied him for a moment, this man who'd walked into her quiet life and turned it upside down in the span of 2 days. "Can I ask you something, Boone? Something that's got nothing to do with Daniel or Frank?" He raised an eyebrow, a little wary, but nodded. "Go ahead." "How does a man end up here?" she asked. "In the club, I mean, wearing that jacket. What's your story?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly on the table. Carol wondered if she'd overstepped, if she'd asked something too personal, too raw. But then he started talking, his voice low and steady. "I grew up rough," he said. "My daddy drank. My mama left when I was 7, and after that it was just me and him, and he wasn't much of a father when he was sober, let alone when he wasn't. I was in and out of trouble by the time I was 13. Stealing, fighting, the whole mess. Nobody expected much out of me." Carol listened, her hands wrapped around her own cup, saying nothing, letting him find his words. "I met some of the club members when I was 19, Boone continued. Fixed one of their bikes for cheap, just trying to make a little cash. They saw something in me, I guess. Started teaching me things. How to work on engines, how to ride. But more than that, they started treating me like I mattered. Like I was somebody's son, somebody's brother, even though I wasn't blood to any of them." "That's when you joined?" Carol asked softly. "Took years before they let me patch in," Boone said. "You gotta earn it. Gotta prove you're loyal, that you'll show up when it counts. But once you're in, Carol, you're in for life. That's not just words on a jacket. That's family. Real family. The kind that shows up at 3 in the morning if you call. The kind that buries you proper if something happens, and takes care of the people you leave behind. Carol felt something in her chest loosen, hearing him talk. She'd seen the leather, the patches, the tattoos, and she'd made her own quiet assumptions, same as anyone else in this town might have. But listening to him now, she saw something else. A boy who'd never had anyone, finding a family that chose him. "Is that what this is?" she asked. "Finding Frank's widow? Is that part of taking care of your own?" Boone's jaw tightened, and he looked down at his coffee before meeting her eyes again. "The club's got what we call a benevolent fund. Money set aside for the families of brothers who die in service, protecting others, doing something honorable. Frank earned that fund the day he ran into that burning building. Wasn't a question in anybody's mind." He paused. But nobody could find his widow. 15 years, Carol. 15 years of records searched, old contacts tracked down, dead ends everywhere. Some of the older members gave up hope of ever finding her. "But you didn't," Carol said quietly. "I made it my mission," Boone admitted. "Not because anybody ordered me to, because it felt wrong, letting a man's sacrifice go unhonored like that. Felt wrong letting his family go without what was owed to them. That's not duty, Carol. That's just what you do for family, even family you never met." Carol looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted inside her. This wasn't some stranger in leather who'd walked into her diner uninvited. This was a man who understood loss the same way she did, who carried other people's grief like it was his own, who believed loyalty meant something even after death. For the first time since he'd walked through that door, Carol didn't feel afraid of Boone Kessler at all. She felt like she'd found someone who understood. Boone set his cup down slow, like he was working up to something. Carol noticed the change in his face right away. The easy openness from a moment ago had tightened into something more careful. "There's something else?" he said. "Something I found out this morning before I came by." Carol's stomach dropped a little. "What is it?" "I got a call from one of the older members, a guy who keeps the club's paperwork going back decades. He was digging through old files, trying to help me track down anything else on Frank." Boone leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "Turns out Frank rented a storage unit back in Bardstown, about 40 minutes from here. Rented it a few months before the fire. Nobody's touched it since he died." 15 years, Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody knew to look for it," Boone said. "It wasn't in his regular name. He used his road name on the paperwork. Preacher. That's why it never came up before now." Carol felt her hands go cold around her coffee cup. "What do you think is in there?" "I don't know," Boone admitted. "Could be nothing. Could be old bike parts, spare clothes, junk he never bothered clearing out. But it could be something more." He paused, watching her carefully. "I think we should go see. Tomorrow, if you're willing." Carol sat with that for a moment. Part of her wanted to say no, wanted to tell Boone that she'd already had enough surprises for one lifetime crammed into 2 days. Her hand still trembled sometimes when she thought about the letters, about Daniel's secret grief, about 30 years of marriage she was only now starting to understand. But another part of her, a part that had been quiet and small for a long time, wanted to know. Needed to know. She thought of Daniel, of the locked drawer she'd never opened out of respect, of the photograph she'd found once and never questioned. She thought about all the years she'd spent not asking, not pushing, and where that had gotten her. Nowhere but alone with her grief and no answers. "I'll go," she said. "What time?" "I'll pick you up at 9, Boone said. "It's not far. We can be there and back before your evening shift." Carol nodded. though her heart was pounding harder than she wanted to admit. The next morning came gray and cool, mist still clinging to the fields along the highway, as Boone's truck rumbled toward Bardstown. Carol sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tight in her lap, watching the fence posts blur past the window. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. The storage facility sat off a side road, a long row of metal units with faded numbers painted above each door. A heavy-set man in a ball cap met them at the office, thumbing through an old ledger while Boone explained the situation, showing him copies of paperwork he'd printed the night before, proof of Frank's death, records from the club confirming the unit had never been reported abandoned. 15 years is a long time, the manager said, scratching his neck. Normally we'd have auctioned off anything unclaimed by now. But this one's marked special. Somebody paid it off for life. Whole thing's prepaid, if you can believe that. Guess whoever set it up figured somebody would come looking eventually. He led them down the row to Unit 114, the metal door streaked with rust, the padlock crusted over with years of grime. Boone pulled a bolt cutter from his truck bed and set to work on the lock while Carol stood back, arms wrapped around herself despite the mild morning air. The lock gave way with a sharp snap, and Boone rolled the door up with a metal groan that echoed down the row. Inside, the unit was small, maybe 10 feet deep, filled with shadows and the smell of old leather and motor oil. A jacket hung from a hook on the wall, cracked and faded, but unmistakably a biker's cut, patches still visible beneath a layer of dust. Motorcycle parts sat stacked in the corner, chrome dulled with age, and tucked beside them, half hidden under an old blanket, sat a small wooden box with a brass latch, weathered but intact. Carol stepped forward before she realized she was moving, her eyes fixed on the box. Her hands were shaking as she reached for it, lifting the blanket away, feeling the years pressed into every corner of that unit settle heavy on her chest. Boone stood back and watched her, quiet, waiting. The brass latch was rusted shut, stubborn with age. Boone knelt beside Carol and worked at it with careful fingers, not wanting to force it, not wanting to break whatever secrets waited inside. After a moment, the metal gave with a small groan, and the lid creaked open on hinges that hadn't moved in 15 years. Carol leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, stacks of envelopes sat bound together with a rubber band that had gone brittle and cracked. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting on each envelope was clear enough to read. The same 4 words, written over and over in the same careful hand. My brother Danny. Carol pressed her fingers to her mouth. There had to be 20 of them, maybe more. Some looked older. The ink faded to a soft brown. Others looked newer, the paper crisper, like they'd been written closer to the end. Beneath the letters sat a small notebook, its cover worn soft at the corners, the kind of notebook a man might carry in his jacket pocket for years. And tucked beside that, protected in a plastic sleeve gone cloudy with age, was a photograph. Carol lifted it out with trembling hands. 2 boys stood in the picture, maybe 10 and 12 years old, squinting against the sun in some backyard long since forgotten. Their arms were slung around each other's shoulders, gap-toothed grins on both their faces, the kind of joy that only exists before the world has had a chance to complicate things. She didn't need anyone to tell her who they were. She could see Daniel in the smaller boy's eyes, the same softness that had looked back at her every morning for 30 years, and beside him, taller, bolder, laughing louder, stood Frank. They were just kids, Carol whispered. Boone didn't say anything. He just watched her, his big hands resting on his knees, giving her the space she needed. Carol held the photograph a long moment, tracing the edge of it with her thumb. feeling something crack open inside her chest. All those years she thought she'd married a quiet man with no family, no history worth mentioning. And here he was, laughing in the sunshine, arm around a brother he'd loved enough to grieve in silence for the rest of his life. She set the photograph carefully back in the box and looked at the stack of letters, unopened, waiting. Her hand hovered over them, but she pulled back, like the cold concrete floor and the smell of motor oil and dust weren't the right place for what these letters held. "I can't," she said quietly. "Not here." Boone looked at her, his brow furrowing with concern. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to read these in a storage unit, Boone." Her voice wavered, but there was a strength underneath it, something firming up inside her even as her hands still trembled. "Frank wrote these with love in his heart. Whatever's in them, it deserves better than concrete walls and rusted locks." "Where do you want to go?" Carol thought of the diner, of the corner booth where she'd poured coffee for 15 years, of Miss Peggy's laugh and Earl's crossword puzzles and the warm smell of biscuits in the morning. She thought of Pastor Mike, who understood things about Frank that she never could on her own. She thought about not being alone when the truth finally came out, whatever that truth turned out to be. "Take me back to Millie's," she said. "Call Pastor Mike. Ask him to meet us there." "I don't want to do this by myself, Boone. I don't think I can." Boone nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what she meant. "I'll call him from the truck." Together they packed the box carefully, laying the letters back in their place, tucking the notebook beside them, setting the photograph gently on top where Carol could reach it easy if she needed to look at those two boys again. Boone lifted the box like it weighed far more than wood and paper, cradling it against his chest as he carried it out to the truck. He set it carefully on the seat between them, wedging an old blanket around it so it wouldn't slide. Carol climbed in after it, her hand resting on the lid without meaning to, like she could feel Frank's voice waiting inside, patient after all these years. Boone climbed behind the wheel and started the engine, the weight of what they'd found settling heavy and quiet between them as they pulled out of the storage lot and onto the road toward home. The diner sat quiet after hours, the neon sign in the window switched off, the chairs still down from the evening rush. Miss Peggy had put on a fresh pot of coffee anyway, out of habit more than need, and the smell of it filled the room like something familiar to hold on to. Pastor Mike sat at the counter, his weathered hands folded in front of him. Earl had pulled a chair over from the corner booth, his crossword puzzle forgotten in his shirt pocket. Brittany, Sasha, and Kayla stood near the door, quiet in a way they hadn't been quiet before, like they understood they were guests in something bigger than themselves. Carol sat at the corner booth with the wooden box in front of her. Boone sat across from her, his big frame folded into the small space, watching her with the patience of a man who had waited 15 years for this moment and could wait a little longer if she needed it. "You don't have to do this tonight," Boone said softly. "Yes, I do." Carol's hands shook as she untied the brittle rubber band. It snapped and fell away. "I've waited long enough. We all have." She lifted the first letter, the oldest one. The ink faded to a soft brown. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. "Dear Danny," she read, her voice cracking on the name. "I know you're still sore about what happened with Dad's shop. I know you think I took his side because I wanted to. But that ain't true, brother. I was scared. Scared the business was going under and scared you'd hate me for saying so out loud. I didn't mean the things I said. I want to fix this. Come by the garage Sunday. I'll have coffee waiting." Carol looked up. Miss Peggy had her hand pressed to her chest. Earl stared down at the table. She opened the next one, and the next, her voice growing steadier as she went. Each letter carried the same ache, the same reaching out. Frank apologizing, Frank begging, Frank promising that whatever pride had come between them, it wasn't worth losing a brother over. "He tried so many times," Carol whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Daniel never wrote back, not once." "Some men carry shame like it's armor," Pastor Mike said gently. "They think silence protects the people they love. Sometimes it just protects their own hurt." Carol nodded, though her eyes never left the page. She read through letter after letter, years passing in Frank's handwriting, the ink changing, the paper changing, but the message underneath always the same. "Come home. I forgive you. I miss you." The young women had moved closer without anyone noticing, drawn in by the weight of it, their phones forgotten in their pockets for the first time since they'd walked into Millie's. Finally, Carol reached the last envelope. The paper was crisp, newer than the rest, barely worn at all, her hands stilled over it. "This one's from right before," Boone said quietly, reading the date on the corner. "Weeks before the fire." Carol's breath caught. She opened it slowly, like she was afraid of what it might say, afraid and desperate to know all at once. "Dear Danny," she read, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if you'll ever read this one, same as the others, but I need to say it anyway. Whatever happened between us, I forgive you completely. I hope you'll forgive me too. I got the tattoo so you'd know, wherever I go, you're part of me. Rose for Mom, wings for the both of us, flying free of all this old hurt. I love you, brother. I always did." The words hung in the air of the quiet diner, and Carol's voice broke apart on the last line. The letter slipped from her fingers and landed soft on the table. She pressed both hands to her face and wept, her shoulders shaking, 30 years of unanswered questions finally finding their answer in a dead man's handwriting. Daniel hadn't been hiding shame. He'd been carrying grief so heavy he couldn't set it down, not even for the woman he loved. Miss Peggy was crying too, her hand over her mouth. Earl blinked hard and looked away, his jaw tight. Pastor Mike bowed his head. Boone reached across the table and covered Carol's trembling hands with his own, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The three young women stood by the door, tears streaking down their faces, silent witnesses to a love that had outlasted death itself. No one in the diner moved. No one spoke. The only sound was Carol's quiet weeping and the soft hum of the coffee pot still warming on the back counter. Morning light spilled soft and gold across Millie's diner, catching the dust that floated lazy in the air. Carol stood behind the counter, tying her apron strings, and for the first time in years, she felt like her hands weren't shaking from grief. They were steady, light almost. She'd slept only a few hours, but it was the best sleep she'd had in a long time. No dreams of Daniel's sad eyes in October. No wondering what he wasn't telling her. Just quiet. Just peace. She rolled her sleeves up past her elbows and looked at the rose and wings on her arm in the mirror behind the counter. For the first time, looking at it didn't feel like looking at a secret. It felt like looking at a love story. "You're humming," Miss Peggy said, coming through the kitchen door with a tray of clean mugs. "Don't think I've heard you hum before." "Didn't think I had a reason to," Carol said and smiled. Outside, Boone sat in his truck in the gravel lot, phone pressed to his ear, one boot propped against the dashboard. He'd woken up before dawn, too full of purpose to stay in bed. 15 years of searching, and now it was almost done. All that was left was to make the call, get the paperwork moving, and put the last piece of Frank's wish into the world. He pictured Carol's face when she found out there was money waiting for her. Real money. Enough to fix that leaky roof over the diner's back room. Enough to finally take a vacation she'd never let herself have. The phone rang twice before a man picked up. National office, this is Russ. Russ, it's Boone Kessler, out of the Kentucky chapter. I'm calling about the Preacher Frank Benevolent Fund. I found her. Found his widow. The woman the money was meant for. There was a pause on the line, longer than Boone expected. Say that again? Frank's fund. The one set up after the fire, back in '09. I finally located his sister-in-law. Well, she's his widow through his brother, but she's the rightful recipient. I need to know what paperwork we need for release. Another pause. Boone frowned, adjusting the phone against his ear. Russ, you there? I'm here. Russ's voice had changed. Careful now. Slow. Boone, listen, I need you to sit tight a second. Let me pull some old files. Boone waited, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, watching through the diner window as Carol moved behind the counter, pouring coffee for Earl, laughing at something he said. She looked lighter than Boone had ever seen her. He'd done that. He and Frank's letters had done that. Russ came back on the line, and something in his tone made Boone's stomach drop before he even said the words. Boone, I don't know how to tell you this. Just say it. The fund. It was managed by Charlie Voss back before he passed. Cancer got him. Must be 6, 7 years back now. Nobody ever went back through his books real close because, well, there wasn't a claim to pay out, no one to send it to. But I'm pulling the file now, and it looks like Charlie moved that money into some investments, said it was to grow it for whenever somebody did show up. And the investments went bad, real bad. Whole thing collapsed back in 2014. There's nothing left, Boone, not a dime. Boone sat very still, the phone heavy against his ear, the words landing on him like stones. There's got to be something. Some record, some backup account. I wish I could tell you different. I'm sorry. I truly am. Charlie's gone, so there's nobody left to even ask what happened to it. The fund's just gone. Boone thanked Russ in a voice that didn't sound like his own, and set the phone down on the seat beside him. He stared through the windshield at the diner, at Carol's shape moving behind the glass, cheerful and unaware, humming to herself as she filled the sugar dispensers along the counter. His hands, so steady a moment ago, gripped the steering wheel now like he needed something to hold on to. He thought about her face last night, streaked with tears, finally understanding her husband's whole heart. He thought about the promise he'd carried in his chest for 15 years, the promise to make things right for Frank's family. And now he had nothing to give her but more heartbreak. Boone sat frozen in the truck, unable to open the door, unable to walk inside and tell Carol that the gift he'd promised her didn't exist. That after everything, after all that pain dug back up, there was nothing waiting for her at the end of it. The morning went on without him. Carol kept glancing at the door every time the bell jingled, expecting to see Boone's broad shoulders fill the frame, that leather cut of his catching the light. He'd said he would come by. He'd said it plain as day, standing in the parking lot last night, his eyes still red from all the letters they'd read together. I'll be here first thing, he'd told her. We got paperwork to talk about. But the clock over the pie case ticked past 8, then 9, and his truck never pulled into the gravel lot. By 9:30, the worry had settled into her chest like a stone. She wiped her hands on her apron and pulled her phone from her pocket, the same phone she'd barely used in years except to check on her sister in Ohio. She found Boone's number, the one he'd written on a napkin 2 nights ago in blocky, careful handwriting. She pressed call and held the phone to her ear, listening to it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then his voicemail picked up, his voice gruff and short, telling her to leave a message. She didn't leave one. She just hung up and stared at the phone like it might ring back on its own. "Something wrong, hun?" Miss Peggy asked, setting down a rack of clean silverware. "Boone said he'd be here this morning." Carol's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "He's not answering his phone." Peggy's brow creased, but she didn't say anything to worry Carol further. "Maybe he's just running late. Man like that's got a lot on his plate." Carol nodded, but the feeling in her stomach didn't ease. She thought about calling Pastor Mike, the older man who'd sat with them at the storage unit, who'd known Frank back when he was young and wild and full of fire. She found his number in the little address book she kept behind the register, the one with softened corners and coffee stains on the cover. He picked up on the second ring. "Carol," he said, his voice warm even through the phone. "Everything all right? I was hoping you could tell me. Boone was supposed to come by the diner this morning and he never showed. I called him and he's not answering." There was a pause on the line, and in that pause, Carol felt her heart tighten. "He called me," Pastor Mike said slowly. "Early, real early, before sunup." "What did he say?" Another pause. She could hear Pastor Mike choosing his words, the way careful men do when they're carrying bad news they don't want to drop too hard. "He sounded rough, Carol, not himself, kept talking about the fund, saying something about how it was gone, said he felt like he'd failed you." "Failed Frank." Carol's hand tightened around the phone. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I don't have the whole story. He didn't stay on the line long enough to tell me everything. But he sounded low, Carol. Real low. Like a man who thinks he's let everybody down and doesn't know how to face them." Carol's mind raced back to last night, to Boone's face as he watched her read Frank's letters, the way his jaw had tightened like he was holding something in. She'd thought it was just the weight of the moment. Now she wondered if it had been something else. Something he hadn't said. "Thank you, Pastor Mike," she said, already reaching for her coat behind the counter. "I need to find him." She hung up and stood there a moment, her thoughts scattering like startled birds. Then she remembered it. A small detail from days ago, tossed off so casual she'd nearly forgotten it. Boone mentioning the motel off Route 9, the one with the flickering blue sign, where he'd been staying since he first rolled into town looking for her. She untied her apron with hands that weren't steady anymore. "Peggy," she called across the diner, "I need you to cover for me." Peggy looked up, surprised, a coffee pot still in her hand. "Carol, honey, what's going on?" "I think Boone's about to leave town," Carol said, already halfway to the door. "And I don't think he means to say goodbye." The Blue Star Motel sat off Route 9 like something time forgot. A row of 10 rooms with a flickering neon sign that buzzed even in daylight. Carol's old sedan crunched over the gravel lot, and there, parked outside room number 6, sat Boone's motorcycle. Chrome catching the morning sun. Still there. Relief flooded her chest, quick and sharp, followed just as fast by dread. If his bike was here, that meant he was too, and that meant Pastor Mike had been right to worry. She parked crooked, not caring, and walked fast across the lot, her waitress shoes crunching on the loose stone. The door to room 6 had a brass number hanging crooked on one screw. She knocked, 3 times, hard. Nothing. She knocked again. "Boone, it's Carol. I know you're in there." A long pause stretched out, long enough that she wondered if she'd have to go find the motel office and ask them to check on him. Then she heard the chain slide back, the lock turn, and the door opened slow. Boone stood in the doorway, and Carol almost didn't recognize him. The big man who'd walked into Millie's diner like he owned the ground under his boots looked smaller somehow. Shoulders curled forward like a weight sat on them. His eyes were red-rimmed and tired, like he hadn't slept, or had slept and woken up more exhausted than before. Behind him, on the unmade bed, sat a duffel bag, zipped and packed, his leather cut folded neatly on top of it. Carol. Her name came out rough, like his throat wasn't working right. You shouldn't have come out here. Pastor Mike called me, said you sounded low. She stayed in the doorway, not pushing past him, giving him room. Said something about the fund. Boone's jaw tightened. He looked past her, out at the parking lot, at anything except her face. Yeah, the fund. He let out a breath that shook a little on its way out. Might as well come in. Ain't much point hiding it now. He stepped back and let her into the room. It smelled like stale coffee and cheap motel soap. Carol stood near the door, while Boone sat down heavy on the edge of the bed, right next to the packed bag, like he hadn't even had it in him to move it out of sight. I got a call last night, he said, staring at his hands, at the thick, scarred knuckles resting on his knees. From the National Office, the benevolent fund, the one set aside for Frank's family all those years back. It's gone, Carol. Some treasurer years ago, he's passed now, God rest him, but he put it into bad investments. Lost it all. There's nothing left, not a dime. Carol's stomach dropped, but she kept quiet, letting him finish. I spent 10 years looking for you, Boone went on, his voice cracking. Telling myself if I ever found Frank's widow, I'd be handing her something that mattered, something that'd make up for the years she went without. And now I find you, and all I got to give you is a bunch of old letters that tore your whole world apart, and nothing to show for it. Nothing to fix what I broke open. He shook his head, staring at the floor. I was gonna leave before you had to see my face again. Figured it was easier that way. Less painful for you. I didn't want you looking at me and seeing another man who let you down. He gestured weakly at the duffel bag beside him, like it explained everything. I'm sorry, Carol. I truly am. I came here thinking I was bringing you something good, and all I did was dig up 30 years of grief and hand you nothing but heartbreak in return. The room went quiet, except for the hum of the old air conditioner rattling in the window. Boone sat there, head down, looking like a man waiting for a judgment he already believed he deserved. Carol crossed the room slowly and sat down in the chair across from him, close enough that their knees almost touched. She reached out and put a gentle hand on his arm, feeling him tense under her touch. Boone, she said softly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Sit still and listen. I need to say something, and I need you to hear it before you go anywhere. Boone lifted his head, slow, like it cost him something to do it. His eyes met hers, red and raw, and he didn't say anything. He just waited. You think that money was ever the point? Carol said. You've been carrying that around for 10 years like it's the only thing worth bringing me. But Boone, listen to me. I didn't need a check. I didn't need a bank envelope full of money that came from some fund I never even knew existed until 3 weeks ago. She squeezed his arm, gentle but firm, the way she might steady a customer who'd had too much bad news in one sitting. What you gave me was 30 years back, she went on. 30 years I thought I understood my husband. 30 years I thought I knew every corner of his heart. And I did know him, Boone. I knew the way he liked his eggs, the way he hummed old country songs while he fixed cars in the garage, the way he'd rub my shoulders after a long shift without me even asking. I knew all that, But I didn't know why he went quiet every October. I didn't know why he flinched at funeral processions. I didn't know there was a hole in him shaped exactly like his brother. Her voice caught, but she pushed through it. Now I know. Now when I think about him, I don't think about a man keeping secrets from his wife. I think about a man who loved his brother so much that losing him without ever making it right nearly broke him in half. I think about a man who carried that grief every single day and never once let it make him bitter or cold. He still loved me the whole time, Boone. Fully. Completely. He just had one wound he didn't know how to show me. And now I know why it was there. Now I know it wasn't about me at all. It was about a boy who fought with his brother once, a long time ago, and never got the chance to say he was sorry. Boone's throat worked like he was trying to swallow something too big to go down easy. You gave me that, Carol said. Those letters, Frank's own words, his forgiveness, his love for a brother he never stopped waiting on. That's not nothing, Boone. That's everything. That's worth more than any amount of money sitting in some account. You can't put a dollar sign on knowing the truth about the man you loved for 30 years. You just can't. Boone dropped his eyes to the floor again. But this time it wasn't shame pulling them down. It was something else. Something softer. I never thought about it like that, he said, and his voice came out rough, almost a whisper. All these years, I kept telling myself the money was the whole reason. That's what I owed Frank's family. That's what would make it right. What would prove the club hadn't forgotten him, hadn't let him down after everything he did. I never once thought that maybe the letters were the real gift all along. Maybe that's what he would have wanted delivered more than any check. He shook his head slow, like a man waking up from a long sleep. I've been so fixed on fixing something with money, I never stopped to think there might be things money can't touch. Things that matter more. They do, Carol said. They matter more than you know. Boone sat there a long moment, looking at her like he was seeing something new, something he hadn't let himself see before. Then his gaze drifted to the duffel bag beside him. Packed tight, his leather cut folded on top like a flag laid to rest. He reached over and set his hand on it, but he didn't pick it up. Instead, he unzipped it, slow, and pulled his folded cut back out. He set it across his knees and looked at it for a moment, running his thumb over the worn leather. Guess there ain't no reason to run off just yet, he said. And for the first time since Carol had walked into that room, something like the ghost of a smile crossed his face. Not if there's still something worth sticking around for. He set the duffel bag back down on the bed, unpacked, and looked up at Carol with eyes that weren't quite so tired anymore. News in a small town moves like water, finding cracks in a sidewalk. It doesn't need help. It just goes. By Tuesday morning, everybody at Millie's Diner knew the story. Not the gossip version either, the real one. Carol hadn't meant to tell it all at once, but Miss Peggy had asked, gentle as anything, "Honey, you doing all right?" And something about the kindness in her voice cracked Carol wide open. She told her about Frank, about the letters, about Daniel and his brother, and the 30 years of quiet grief hiding behind a closed drawer. Miss Peggy had pressed a hand to her chest and gone still for a long moment. Then she said, "Well, I think we ought to do something for that man. Both of them, really." Earl, sitting 2 stools down with his coffee going cold, set his cup back in its saucer. "Do something? Like what?" "Like give them a place," Miss Peggy said. "Right here, somewhere folks can sit and remember." That was all it took. By Wednesday, half the diner was talking about it. Table to table, booth to booth. Somebody suggested a plaque. Somebody else said flowers, real ones, not plastic. Old Mr. Denny, who ran the hardware store 2 doors down, offered to donate the wood for a frame. It seemed like everyone wanted a piece of it, a way to hold on to something bigger than themselves. Even Brittany, Sasha, and Kayla showed up Thursday afternoon, hesitant at first, standing just inside the door like they weren't sure they belonged. Carol saw them and didn't turn away. She waved them over instead. "We saw the video going around," Sasha said, twisting her hands together. "The one somebody posted, about what happened here, about Frank." She swallowed hard. "We feel just awful about before, about laughing at you." "We want to help," Kayla added quickly. "If that's okay, we don't want money or anything. We just want to do something right for once." Carol looked at the three of them, remembering the sting of that first day, the phones held up, the laughter that had made her want to disappear. But she saw something different in their faces now. Something humbled. "You can help," she said simply. "There's plenty to do." And so they did. Brittany turned out to have a steady hand for lettering and spent an evening painting a small sign for the window. Sasha organized folding chairs borrowed from the church basement. Kayla, of all people, tracked down a woodworker 2 towns over who agreed to carve a plaque for almost nothing once he heard the story. Boone stayed the whole week, sleeves rolled up, helping Earl move tables and string small white lights along the diner's porch rail. He didn't say much, but he worked hard, like his hands needed something to do so his heart wouldn't get too loud. By Friday evening, the plaque was ready. Small, simple brass letters set into dark wood. It read, "Frank and Daniel's Corner." Beneath the names, engraved careful and fine, sat the rows and wings spread wide like something ready to take flight. Carol ran her fingers over it when Mr. Denny brought it in, and her eyes filled up before she could stop them. They mounted it above the corner booth, the one by the window where morning light always came in soft and gold. Miss Peggy set a small vase of fresh roses on the table beneath it. Somebody, nobody quite remembered who, left a photograph of Daniel tucked into the corner of the frame, smiling the way he used to before all his quiet Octobers. Saturday evening came warm and golden, the kind of evening where the whole sky seemed to soften. Folks started arriving before the sun even dipped low, spilling out from the diner's front porch and into the gravel lot. Fold-up chairs lined the sidewalk. Someone had strung more lights across the porch beams, and they glowed soft against the dusk. Carol stood near the door, in a blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, tattoo bare for the world to see. Boone stood beside her, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, looking more nervous than Carol had ever seen a man his size look. He kept glancing at the gathering crowd, then back at her, like he needed to borrow some of her steadiness. "You ready?" he asked quietly. Carol looked out at the faces gathering under the fading light, Earl and Peggy near the porch steps, the 3 young women standing close together, half the town filling in behind them. "I think so," she said. "Are you?" Boone let out a breath, long and slow. "Working on it." Pastor Mike stepped up onto the porch, his old boots creaking against the wood. He was a tall man once, folks said, before age bent his shoulders and turned his beard white. He held his cut in his hands instead of wearing it, out of respect, and the leather looked worn, soft as an old Bible. "I didn't know Frank Whitfield as a boy," he began, voice low and rough like gravel under tires. "I knew him as a man already grown into who he was going to be. Loud laugh, big heart, the kind of fellow who'd give you the shirt off his back and then ask if you needed his jacket too." A few people chuckled softly. Boone's jaw tightened beside Carol, his eyes shining in the porch light. "Frank used to say brotherhood wasn't about blood," Pastor Mike went on. "Said it was about who shows up, who stays. But I think," he paused, looking right at Carol, "I think deep down, he never stopped hoping his real blood would show up too. his brother. And now we know he did. Just quieter than Frank ever was. He let that settle over the crowd, like dust after a long ride. Then he nodded toward Carol. I think there's somebody here who's got more to say than I do. Carol felt her knees go soft as she stepped forward. Every face in that crowd turned toward her, waiting, patient, kind. Earl gave her a small nod. Miss Peggy pressed both hands to her heart. Even the three young women stood at the edge of the gathering, quiet and still, eyes wide. Carol opened her mouth, and for a moment nothing came out at all. Her voice caught somewhere deep in her chest, tangled up with 30 years of silence. I've stood behind that counter a long time, she finally said, her voice shaking. 15 years, pouring coffee, wiping tables, listening to y'all talk about your lives. And this whole time, I never told anybody about mine. She looked down at her arm, at the long sleeve she wasn't wearing anymore. I was ashamed, she admitted. Not of my husband. Never of him. I was ashamed because I didn't understand something he carried his whole life, and I thought that meant I'd failed him somehow. Like I should have known, should have asked harder questions. Her eyes found Boone's. He gave her the smallest nod, the kind that said, "Keep going. You're doing just fine." But I learned something this week, Carol said, steadier now. I learned that love doesn't always come with easy answers. Sometimes it comes wrapped up in grief so old it's turned to silence. My husband carried a hurt so deep he couldn't even hand it to me. Not because he didn't trust me, because he couldn't forgive himself long enough to speak it out loud. She reached down and slowly, deliberately, rolled her sleeve up past her elbow. The rose and wings caught the porch light, faded but unmistakable, delicate lines etched into skin that had hidden them for 30 years. A soft gasp moved through the crowd, but it wasn't mockery this time. It was something closer to reverence. This isn't biker ink, Carol said, her voice growing clear and strong. This is two brothers, Frank and Daniel, one who lived loud and gave his life saving 3 children from a fire, one who lived quiet, carrying guilt he never let go of. This rose is forgiveness. These wings are 2 men who loved each other even when pride and grief kept them apart. That's what this is. That's what I've been hiding under long sleeves for 15 years. Nobody spoke for a moment. Miss Peggy was openly crying now, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin from her apron pocket. Earl cleared his throat hard, blinking fast. Then Brittany stepped forward, her voice small and thick with tears. "Miss Carol," she said, "would it be... do you think it'd be okay if we got a little rose too? Just small, just so we'd remember?" Sasha nodded beside her, tears slipping down her cheeks freely now. "We don't want to forget what we learned. About you. About judging people before we know their story." Kayla wiped her face with the back of her hand. "We were so wrong about you," she whispered. "We just want to carry a piece of this with us, if that's all right." Carol looked at the 3 young women for a long moment. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I think Frank would like that just fine," she said. "You go on and get your roses. Just make sure you tell the story right when folks ask." That was the last big moment of the ceremony. After that, the crowd broke into smaller groups, hugging, talking low, wiping their eyes. But the real change came in the weeks after, in the quiet, ordinary days that followed. Boone had planned to leave town the Monday after the ceremony. He told Carol as much, standing by his motorcycle outside the diner, one hand resting on the worn leather seat like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. But Monday came and went, and his bike stayed parked behind Millie's diner, tucked next to the dumpster where Earl usually kept his truck. "Figured I'd stick around a bit," Boone said, when Carol asked him about it over a cup of coffee. He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked down at his hands, thick and scarred from decades of engine work and long roads. "Town's got good pie." Carol laughed, really laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Is that so?" "That's so," Boone said, and a small smile cracked through his beard. He started showing up every morning after that. Same booth by the window, the one that used to be empty most days until Frank and Daniel's names went up on the little brass plaque. He'd order black coffee and eggs, and he'd stay long past when the food was gone, talking with Earl about trucks, letting Miss Peggy fuss over him like he was one of her own grandsons. Sometimes he helped Carol with things around the diner that needed a strong back. The walk-in cooler door had been sticking for years, and Boone fixed it in an afternoon without being asked. He patched the leak in the roof over the storage room. He even taught Carol how to check the oil in her old car, standing beside her in the gravel lot, his big hands guiding hers gently over the dipstick. "Wasn't much of a mechanic myself before Frank," he admitted one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag. "But your husband knew his way around an engine better than any man I ever met, and I figure that's got to count for something. Least I can do is keep his memory going a little." Carol didn't say much back. She just nodded, feeling something warm settle into her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. Not romance, nothing like that. Something steadier. Something that felt like family showing up when you didn't even know you needed it. One evening, after closing, Boone sat across from her in the empty diner, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. He pulled a folded flyer from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. "Club does this every December," he said. "Toy drive. We ride out to different towns, deliver presents to kids who wouldn't get much otherwise. Some of these kids, their daddies are locked up or gone or just can't afford much of anything. We also got a program helping veterans get back on their feet. Job training, a place to stay if they need it, somebody to talk to who understands what they went through." Carol looked at the flyer, studying the photographs of grinning bikers handing out wrapped boxes to wide-eyed children, of a barbecue where veterans sat laughing together at long picnic tables. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. Boone shrugged, but his eyes were serious. "Figured maybe you'd want to help. You got a good heart, Carol, bigger than you know. Frank always said the best kind of people didn't even realize how much good they had in them until somebody asked." Carol sat with that for a long moment, staring at the flyer, feeling something stir inside her that had been dormant since Daniel passed. Purpose. Something to reach toward instead of hide from. "When's the next one?" she asked. Boone smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. 2 weeks. Toy drive out in Bardstown. I can pick you up if you want to ride along." Carol nodded slowly, feeling her heart lift in a way she hadn't expected. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that a whole lot." For the first time in 15 years, Carol Whitfield went to bed that night feeling something close to alive. October came back around, the way it always did. Carol woke up that morning before her alarm even rang. She lay in bed for a minute, looking at the ceiling, waiting for that old heavy feeling to settle onto her chest like it had every year for 15 years. It didn't come. Instead, there was just a quiet kind of calm, like the stillness right after a storm passes through and leaves the air clean. She got up and walked to the kitchen, where Daniel's old calendar still hung on the wall by the fridge. She'd never taken it down, even though it was years out of date now. Her finger found the little circle he'd drawn around a date in October. The ink faded to a pale gray after all this time. She used to think that circle was a wound. Now she understood it was a scar, the kind that meant something had healed, even if it left a mark behind. She made coffee. She got dressed. She picked a small rose from the bush growing by her back porch, the one she'd planted the spring after Daniel died without really knowing why, Its petals were a deep, soft red, the same color as the one inked into her arm. Boone's motorcycle rumbled into the driveway right at 9 o'clock, just like he promised. Pastor Mike rode with him this time, sitting behind Boone with his hands resting easy on the sissy bar, his white beard whipping a little in the wind. Behind them came 3 more bikes, other members of the club Carol had met over the past few months at the toy drives and the veteran cookouts. Big men with kind eyes, men who called her ma'am and meant it. They rode together to the cemetery, Carol following behind in her old car, the rose sitting carefully in a cup holder so it wouldn't tip. The cemetery sat on a hill outside of town, shaded by old oak trees that were just starting to turn gold and orange at the edges. Daniel's headstone was near the back, simple gray granite, his name and dates carved plain and clean. Carol knelt down in the grass, feeling the cool damp of the morning soak through her skirt. She didn't mind. She reached out and brushed a few fallen leaves off the top of the stone, the way she did every year. But this year was different. This year she wasn't just remembering a quiet mechanic who loved her for 30 years. She was remembering a man who carried a mountain of grief on his shoulders and never once let it crush the love he had for her. "I know now, Daniel," she whispered, so soft that only the wind might have caught it. "I know why October was hard. I know why you locked that drawer. I'm not angry anymore. I understand." She placed the rose gently against the base of the headstone, its petals bright against the gray stone. Boone stepped forward then, standing just behind her shoulder. He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in a soft cloth. He knelt down beside Carol, his knees cracking with the effort, and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was Frank's old leather patch, the one with the rose and wings stitched into it, the edges worn soft from years on a jacket that had seen 1,000 miles of road. "This belongs here, too," Boone said, his voice thick. He set the patch down right beside the rose, close enough that they were almost touching. "Reckon it's about time these 2 brothers were together again." Pastor Mike bowed his head. The other club members did the same, taking off their sunglasses, standing quiet and still in a loose half-circle behind Carol and Boone. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The wind moved through the oak trees overhead, and somewhere far off a bird called out, then went quiet. Carol stayed kneeling there a while longer, one hand resting on the cool stone, the other hovering just above the rose and the patch lying side by side in the grass. She felt something settle deep inside her chest, something that had been unsettled for 15 long years. They stood together like that for a long while. The small group gathered on the hillside, honoring 2 brothers who had finally found their way back to each other. Millie's diner smelled like fresh biscuits and strong coffee, same as it always had. But something in the air felt different now. Lighter, somehow, like a window that had been painted shut for years had finally been pried open. Carol moved between the tables with her order pad tucked in her apron, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. The rose and wings tattoo sat right there on her forearm, faded but clear, catching the morning light. She didn't think twice about it anymore. There was a time she would have tugged her sleeve down the second she felt eyes on her arm. Now she just kept pouring coffee, kept smiling, kept living. "Morning, Miss Peggy," she said, topping off a cup at the counter. "You want your usual?" "You know I do, sugar." Peggy patted the stool beside her. "Earl's running late. Says his truck's making a noise again." "That truck's been making a noise since Clinton was president," Carol said, and Peggy laughed loud enough to turn a few heads. The bell above the door jingled, and Carol didn't even need to look up to know who it was. The rumble of motorcycles pulling into the gravel lot outside had become as familiar to her as the sound of the diner's old percolator. Boone ducked through the doorway first, his broad shoulders nearly brushing both sides of the frame. Pastor Mike came in behind him, his white beard neatly combed, followed by two other club members Carol had gotten to know over the past several months. A quiet man named Sawyer, and a heavy-set fellow everybody just called Big Tom. "There's my girl," Boone said, settling into the booth that now had a small brass plaque screwed onto the wall above it. Frank and Daniel's Corner, it read, with a small engraving of a rose and wings beneath the words. "Don't start," Carol said, but she was already grabbing 4 mugs. "I didn't say a thing." "You were about to." Pastor Mike chuckled and slid into the booth across from Boone. "She's got your number, son." They came by most weeks now, sometimes just for coffee and pie, sometimes to help Carol load up boxes for the veteran food drive she'd started volunteering for. It wasn't romantic, what she had with Boone. It was something else, something steadier. Family, she supposed, was the only word that fit right. The kind you didn't choose but ended up choosing anyway, over and over, every time you showed up for each other. Carol poured their coffee and left them to their pie, moving back down the counter to check on her other tables. The diner buzzed along the way it always did on a Tuesday afternoon, forks clinking, the grill sizzling in the back, Earl's truck finally rattling into the lot outside. That's when the bell jingled again, and a young woman walked in alone. She looked to be maybe 25, a backpack slung over one shoulder, the kind of tired, dusty look of someone who'd been driving a long way with no particular place to be. She slid into a booth by the window and picked up a menu, and when Carol came by with a coffee pot and a warm smile, the young woman's eyes landed on Carol's forearm. She didn't sneer. She didn't smirk or reach for her phone. She just tilted her head a little. Curious, the way a person looks at something beautiful they don't understand yet. "That's a pretty tattoo," she said. "Roses and wings. I don't think I've ever seen one like that before. Does it mean something?" Carol set the coffee pot down on the table, unhurried, and pulled her sleeve up a little further so the young woman could see the whole design, the soft petals, the feathered wings curling out from the stem. Boone glanced over from the corner booth, and Carol caught his eye for just a second. He gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "Go on, tell her," and went back to his pie. Carol smiled, the warm afternoon light spilling gold across the table between them, catching the dust in the air like tiny floating stars. "Sit down, honey," Carol said, pulling out the chair across from the young woman. "Let me tell you a story about 2 brothers and a rose that means a whole lot more than you'd ever guess. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you're watching from. Have a wonderful day."